some logic and some coherence, some analysis in what we are about to propose. I think as the process develops, people tend to look into one part more and more, which is the politics, and forget about the other. So what I try to do in my presentation today, try to remind a little bit about what are the main drivers of cap reform, what are the policy targets and implementation challenges, and why greening is a potential paradigm shift. I used to put paradigm shifts that put potential right now, because it depends exactly on the decisions and the implementation. Many of you have seen that, but I think we always start, when we look at the main drivers, in explaining one situation that is totally unique in agriculture. And without getting into the core of it, I think we're going to miss the whole notion of why greening is so important. We're living in a cost-driven commodity price spike world, with price volatility less today than in the past, co-movement of prices and extreme weather events that add uncertainty to the sector, and also a situation where the terms of trade have deteriorated. I think most of you might have seen this graph. It's only updated with the most latest figures. You have in green, the green line is the reversal of the long-term downward trend of agricultural prices in real terms, but you have at the same time a much higher increase in other prices, be it fertilizers, be it energy, or metals and minerals. And why would you say one insists on making that? Because I think in the context of the crisis we have faced recently, we have had two false alarms. I saw the signs of one false alarm again today in the Financial Times. There was a quote from a bank, everything is driven by demand. In 2008, all the debate was about the strong demand of China and India on wheat and rice that explained what happened. It explained nothing, because there was no additional demand from China and India, where we had successive droughts and a very significant supply shock. Last year, we have had one of the most dramatic droughts in the US that made us forget that we also had a drought in Europe. Biofuels doesn't explain what happened last year. Why? Because for 3 years in a row, it stabilized in ethanol use in the US. What is actually happening is a situation where in the various sectors, whether you look at the last 12, 13 years, 2000 to 2012, or in the last 6 years, you have clearly an increase in the level of prices. You see it much more in nominal terms in the agricultural commodities. That is way beyond what we were used in seeing. What does this imply for what we're discussing? I will discuss after showing this graph, which I think is the first time that we present in the public. If you look at what is happening in petrol prices or coal prices, they tend to move in parallel. But what has happened only in the last few years in gas is extremely interesting. With green, you have the evolution of natural gas prices in the US, which have basically collapsed because of the discovery of these new techniques through fracking and new reserves on gas. What you have with purple is our natural gas prices that tend to follow with a delay of 2 years what is happening in the price of petrol. And what you also have is with red, the very significant increase in China, in Asia, that is also linked to what is happening in Japan with the shutting down of many nuclear factories. This has direct implications not only for agriculture, for the economy. It has implications for the reindustrialization of the United States, of the much cheaper cost of energy that they would have to face, but it also has implications for the price that you will have in fertilizers and energy used in agriculture. In this environment, what you have is a situation where the CAP reform has to respond to very concrete questions. Why do we have policies, public policies? Because we have market failures. Where? In the environment, clearly. The market is not going to pay for what the environment delivers. In the functioning of some of the financial markets and their linking commodities, and I'm using some because the issue is not speculation here. The issue is transparency, and the issue is the link of various commodities together, many times without the fundamentals explaining what is happening. You also have to intervene when you have policy failures. The best reform of a certain time might not be suitable for the particular situation. And I'm also glad that you mentioned before what we have put with this notion of jointness, the fact that we need to have a policy that does not treat private and public goods coming from agriculture as competing against each other, but as complements of one and the whole process. So as a background, this is the logic of greening. This is why we propose greening. And whether greening will be successful at the end will depend to a large extent on how much we're going to link the political process and the interest involved in that with the policy process and what generated the interest in greening. I mean, it's not the first time that we make a policy proposal that has some environmental quality objectives. What is important to keep in mind is that we already have implementing mechanisms. And let's try to summarize what we mean. First of all, in terms of cross-compliance, we don't want to intervene in what is law, and we don't pay farmers for what is law. But we want to keep the statutory management requirements in place, including some where there seems to be a debate right now that to some people that in the animal sector we don't really need to have ear tags and traceability and the rest. That at the same time that we have the problems with horse meat discovery. So I think people need to keep that in mind when they come with ideas like that. What we want to do is simplify good agricultural and environmental conditions, but at the same time add very few which relate to climate change action. Cross-compliance applies to all eligible land. And there is nothing new here. It's sort of the stick, if you want, of the policy. If you don't do certain things, you're penalized. Rural development as it exists today and as it will exist in the future is based on voluntary incentives that add, with more targeted measures, benefits to the delivery of the public goods, compensating for costs incurred on income foregone. The difference between the first and the second layer you see here is that rural development, on average, applies with the agro-environmental measures on about 20% of the land. So far, everything is old. And the new component is how to introduce, with green direct payments, a combination of a carrot and a stick, if you want, some mandatory measures with financial support, which are going to be decoupled, are going to be simple, and will have as a target the joint delivery of private and public goods. We have now, with the summit and the decision on the MFF, on the community budget, clearly the decision that 30% of payments will actually be linked to these green measures. So the real question that we have is, what are these measures going to be? Our choice was based on the fact that we have to have measures that target soil erosion, emissions, and biodiversity. These are the three basic measures we propose. Not because we don't believe that there are other measures that do a job, and sometimes a better job, but because the type of measures that you want to have applicable to every eligible hectare have to be simple. Otherwise, when it comes to the implementation, we will end up with a nightmare. But before I go with that, let me clarify a couple of things that also go with greening. First of all, more money for agricultural research, including research that is applied and linked to the questions that the farmers ask on the ground. A European innovation partnership, for which we had the first meeting last week, if I remember well, and which gives concrete ideas about how to bring together all the stakeholders with aspects and elements that work on the ground. And finally, I would say finally, but I don't know if it's going to be final, this is another attempt we make to introduce a mandatory farm advisory system. These are systems that all member states 30 years ago would have. And these are systems now that to many member states do not exist as systems of providing advice to farmers, but as systems that help farmers fill application forms. So where does this lead us? I believe that we are in the process of having a fundamental shift in the policy paradigm of the CAP if we stick relatively close to what was proposed. We know, and it's natural, that the end decision of CAP reform should not be what the Commission proposed. But there has to be some logic and some coherence in what is going to be proposed. And I think it is important to keep in mind that what happens with greening is not independent of what is happening with the redistribution of support. And I'm not talking about the redistribution of support among member states. This has already been decided. But within member states, this is a choice of member states, and the choice they're going to make on the region they will choose will affect land prices, will affect asset values, and will affect the capacity of farmers to absorb or not to absorb greening measures. We also believe that it is important, at the end of the day, whatever happens with greening, to cover as much as possible of eligible land. And finally, to be linked to research, innovation, monitoring, and evaluation aspects. And with that, and outside the presentation, some personal reflections of where the debate is, and I will be finishing. So, Chairman, and I don't know if I have any credit or debit, we will see afterwards.
2 minutes, you do.
Good. Now, first question is on equivalence. Equivalence is a nice and a necessary word, because there is a different state of play among member states on what they have done on agro-environmental measures. The real question mark is how you measure equivalence, who decides about that, and how you put it in practice. Whether you cover all of the areas of the area that has to be covered, how many farmers you affect, and how this is linked with existing second pillar agro-environmental measures. Then there is an issue of controllability. How realistic is what we implement? That's the ex-ante test that you have to pass, because you have to pass an ex-post test. It's not only controllability, it's the actual control elements, the implementation that the member states will have to do, and the monitoring and evaluation of the policy that we will have to do, and the conclusions that the Court of Auditors will have to arrive at when they measure the potential errors up in a way and in the methods that they use. And with that, and without even closing a debate, but just hinting about the type of issues that are discussed right now in the Council, in the Parliament, and very soon between the Council, the Parliament, and the European Commission, for me, there is a choice to be made. And it might be counterintuitive, but it's an important one. The simpler the greening measures are going to be, the more ambitious greening is going to be. That might go against the trend of the current debate. But when you start looking at the details of implementation, I think it will start becoming more clear that it is closer to the truth than what people think. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Tassos, thank you very much indeed. You've very clearly led us to the new support, the new focus for support being on land use, and also the addition of making an effort on climate change. Agriculture can contribute a lot to environment, and also the jointness of the goods, rather than saying that you're in two different, producing two products, environment and food security. They come together. When you're farming in a certain way, you get joint products which are environmental and resource management benefits as well. Okay, so now